All right, so welcome everybody. My name is Dr. Taylor Clem. I'm with IFAS Extension in Alachua County. And welcome and thank you for joining us. This is our first program of the Florida Landscape Crash Course series this year for 2021. And today's program is called The Water's Journey. So I'm here as well as Mark Frank. He's one of our Master Gardener volunteers. So feel free to put any of the questions that you have within the Q&A box, and Mark will help answer some of those questions, and some of them he'll help relay to me. But as we go through this program today, we're not just going to be looking at a PowerPoint. I have like a little activity that we're going to do at the end. And I just want us to start thinking a little bit different about how we look at our landscapes and how we manage our landscapes. So feel free at any time, just put your questions in that Q&A. And of course, at the end of the program, we'll have opportunity for more questions that you all may have. So I want to first start today's discussion with this question. I love asking everybody, where do you live? Now, and feel free to put this in the chat box and write, where do you live? Now, I don't want your specific address. Be general. How do you communicate that with like maybe your friends or family? And sorry, those little gray boxes are popping up so I can monitor those. So yeah, I see like High Springs, Tampa. I'm High Springs. I'm coming at you live from High Springs right now. So High Springs, Gainesville, Alachua, Tampa, Jacksonville, near the river. Oh yeah, St. Johns River. Ocala, Newberry, Pinellas County, St. Pete. Wonderful. Gainesville, Osceola, Brevard County. Oh man, so we're all over the place. Welcome. Welcome, welcome. Yeah, so it's really neat that how y'all are responding. And I kind of do this as a trap. Mark probably knows this question that I've asked before, because what you all did as you respond is 100% accurate, 100% right. But I want us to think a little bit differently, because when we think about where do we live, we think about these geopolitical boundaries, kind of like Alachua County, or maybe Jacksonville. Someone mentioned Newberry, High Springs, Gainesville. Those are those geopolitical boundaries or artificial boundaries that we've created in the landscape as part of political systems governing, you name it. And, that's totally fine, 100% works. But I want us to think differently about that. Because when I ask that question, I want us to think, how do you live like within your environment, within your landscape? So we're going to look at this a little bit further, but I want you to start thinking about that where do you live perspective as we go throughout the program today. So the three essential questions that we're going to talk about, let me get rid of this for you all, that we're going to talk about are what are watersheds, what is the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program, and how are the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program, like the principles and watersheds, all connected. So at the end of this program, I want you to feel pretty confident that you can answer these three major questions. So thinking back, we looked at that geopolitical boundary. That's what a lot of the statements that you all mentioned is like where you lived. But we can think differently about where we live based off of, maybe what are those environmental connections that we may have to the landscape, and how does that influence, or like those connections that we have to the environment around us. So one way that we can define like how we live, for a lot of gardeners, this is a great one that we use quite commonly, and it's the USDA hardiness zones. So, I may live in this climate, I live in the climate zone 9A, or technically High Springs. I guess I'm like on the edge of 8B. So that's a great way that we can think about how we live within that landscape is through that climate zone. Because if you think about that climate zone, it's going to kind of influence native plant communities, the types of plants that can grow, and that's going to have a huge impact on the ecosystem and environment just from that climate. We talk about right plant, right place here in a minute. That's going to be very important designation that we have is what's that climate condition. Other ways that we can think about where we live is our plant communities. So what are those natural plant communities that exist around where we live? Now, I do have to admit This current map is out of date because it shows all of Alachua being in 8B, but Alachua County is mostly 9A now. But look at this map, and where do you live from kind of like a general plant community? Can you kind of find that area where you live, and what's that plant community that you live in? Go ahead and put that in the chat box. Yeah, so some of you are saying that you live in that 9A zone. Can you tell what plant community that you live in? Ah, sandhills, beach coastals. Yeah. So when I look at this, I live in, it's not that dark green. I live in the upland mesic hardwood forest. So that's like your serviceberry, some of your oaks, sweet gums. So a lot of those hardwood plants that grow throughout the area. Hardwood forest, sandhills. Yeah, so yeah, some of you live in that plant community 12. So you can definitely see how maybe those environmental communities, that's an environmental boundary that defines where you live. I live, one person wrote that they live in on, let me see if I can find that in the response really quick. They live in top of the peninsular divide. Sweetwater goes to Atlantic, Hogtown east to the Gulf. So it's like a weird, the continental divide equivalent of in Gainesville. So knowing that environmental, like where do you live within your environment, can make you really think differently on your relationship to what's happening around you and and where you live within your community and your environment. So one way that we can really start to look at this is through watersheds. And that's where we're really going to put a lot of emphasis today. When we're talking about the water's journey, we're really thinking about how does water transect and move about the landscape, and how do we interact with it? So in the state of Florida, we have 5 water management districts. Here in Alachua County, we're split between St. John's and Suwannee River. And someone mentioned in the comments earlier that one side of Gainesville, it's going to head out towards the Atlantic. It ends up in the Alachua, which feeds into the St. John's River and then out into the Atlantic Ocean. Up in Jacksonville, but on the west side of the county, we have like the Hogtown Creek, which, goes into a sink, but part of that's all part of the Suwannee River Water Management District. So here in High Springs, we have the Santa Fe, which connects into the Suwannee River, and then that heads out into the Gulf of Mexico out towards Cedar Key. So our environmental context goes far beyond those geopolitical boundaries, like that city or town or that region that you live in that you define as like those geopolitical boundaries. Florida is a great example. So we kind of look at the state within the context of these different watersheds, but there's more detail to that. So here's just like a very generalized watershed map of Florida. Now, when I ask you, where do you live? What watershed do you live in? Go ahead and put that in the chat box. Yeah, Suwannee River. Some people, I saw Tampa Bay, Kissimmee, Possum Creek. Yeah, Tampa Bay tributaries. Yeah. So we kind of define these with what we call hydrologic unit codes, and that's standardized throughout the United States, and that's kind of the address of your environment based off of watershed. But yeah, so someone mentioned the Alachua, Suwannee. Yeah, Alachua, I think, that's wonderful because it's like our water flows south a little bit and then it loops back in the Alachua and then it flows back north on the St. John's River. So water kind of goes in different directions. So this is just a very generalized map of those watersheds that give a little bit more detail. But you can see that with those watersheds, we live in different parts of the state or different parts of our county, and we have a completely different interaction with our environment. So imagine if in Alachua County, how different the water systems are if you're on the east side versus the west side. That environmental conditions based off of where that water is going, it's heading out. You know, if you're that Sweetwater branch area, going down to Paynes Prairie, you have the Alachua River. That environment ecosystem is quite different than that of the western side of the county. So you can see how these environmental boundaries can really transcend geopolitical boundaries. And it's always kind of been an interesting debate. And we'll talk a little bit about that, but just like, what is a watershed? So, you know, we can define where we live based off of those environmental context, or those environmental boundaries as compared to the geopolitical boundaries. But a watershed essentially it's a collection of water. It's just a big funnel, and the water channels into it to single location. And I say mostly because, you know, all throughout majority of parts of the United States, all the streams will lead and connect to another stream, which flows down and then connects to a bigger stream, which can end up working its way out to a larger body of water. Well, in Florida, we have also recharge zones. So in the western part of Alachua County, you're not necessarily going to have water that ends up in a stream, a creek, or tributary that flows to a larger river, but your water is going to infiltrate into through the soil and recharge the aquifer. So we call those recharge areas as compared to like a watershed, but the idea is still very similar. It's a defined environmental boundary that the water acts in a certain way. And in this case, it infiltrates through the soil and recharges the aquifer. But we also have some other conditions that, you know, we think rather than connecting to a larger stream, we also have sinks. So one of the great ones that I think about, a great example that I think about, is Hogtown Creek. Do you all know where, here in Alachua County, do you all know where the Hogtown Creek ends at? Do you know what that's called? You can put that in the chat box if you know. If you live here in Alachua County, you'll definitely recognize the name, but it's called Hale. So it's the Hale Sink. So Hale Sink is essentially where all the water comes down through Hogtown Creek watershed. And that sink essentially is just what it sounds like. It's a sink, pretty much a direct connection to the aquifer where that water flows and enters the aquifer. And that kind of creates an interesting perspective, because rather than going from river to river to river and working its way out to the ocean, a lot of that water that is coming from the urban landscapes is flowing down, and it's hitting the sink where it's entering directly into the aquifer, and it's carrying all of the pollutants or the garbage or trash or whatever it is with it right down into the aquifer, where we then just bring it back up. So that's kind of an interesting idea that we have those here in Florida, where it's just the sink where the water can just disappear right into the aquifer. And we also have one in Paynes Prairie, of course, but that's a common one for Hogtown Creek. But let's look at the map of the United States. I really love this map. Some of you have probably seen it before, but this is essentially some of the, we're looking at the watersheds, but rather than just a boundary of the watersheds, we have the different colors are the actual streams and tributaries and creeks that feed the larger streams. So by looking at this, you can obviously see what is the total watershed of the Mississippi River. So all water that lands in that area of pink will work its way to its closest creek or stream, and it flows to that larger river, and it flows to that little bit larger river, and it makes its way out to the Mississippi River eventually, where it's dumped out into the Gulf of Mexico. So that's important to think about. So say you're living up in North Dakota, and something that you do that impacts a stream or creek up in North Dakota has a direct impact on all the water downstream and contributes to the impacts that occur within the Gulf of Mexico. So think about that separation that exists right there in that context. You know, something that you do thousands of miles away will have a direct impact on something. Um, and that's also important to think about is these boundaries, like I mentioned earlier, kind of transcend or go beyond those geopolitical boundaries. And that has actually created some nightmares in the state of Florida in the past. And here's a great example. So the Apalachicola River. So when we're thinking about, you know, how are we using water? How do we protect water resources based off of its use for agriculture, human consumption, whatever that use might be? You know, we're dealing with everything upstream as well. So Apalachicola River, you know, its part in Florida is actually a very short run of the river. Um, but our success of the Apalachicola River is dictated by everything that's happening upstream. So water usage in Atlanta, Georgia, is having a significant impact on stream flows in Apalachicola. So the Apalachicola River, where it comes out into the Gulf of Mexico, that's one of the most important fisheries in Florida for like clams, scallops, fishing, etc. And it is that environment and ecosystem is dependent off of the water flow, the traditional water flow, and that kind of mix of salt water and fresh water. And it's dictated how those coastal ecosystems have all developed. Well, it was back in maybe 2008, 2009, somewhere in that period. Atlanta and Georgia just had a horrible drought, and they were running out of water in their aquifer, not their aquifer, within their reservoirs. And they were on very strict water usage restrictions, and the water that was coming down the Apalachicola River was significantly reduced as compared to its traditional because of drought conditions, but also that usage that people were using upstream. So that had a huge impact on the Gulf of Mexico and the fisheries. And those impacts were directly related to what was happening upstream. And long story short, there is lawsuits between Florida and Georgia. And I don't know all the details of it, but a lot of it had to do with how Georgia was managing the water and the impacts that it has on us. And so you can see the importance of or that role that watersheds can play, because if we're at the very bottom of that funnel where all the water is coming out, we're directly impacted by every single decision that is made upstream, whether it be a decision or environmental condition, like in this case, you know, in extreme drought conditions contributed to it as well. So you can see that those environmental boundaries transcend those geopolitical boundaries. So if you are living upstream, those decisions that you're making directly impact downstream. And so this has been situations where those watersheds have made it difficult for planning and policy decisions. But let's take a flashback real quick. So this is John Wesley Powell. Some of you have probably heard of him. Lake Powell was named after him. Of course, one of the participants today emailed me and said, I don't know how excited this man would be to have the Lake Powell named after him, which is true. I don't know how excited he'd be either. But this man is John Wesley Powell. He's an American explorer and frontiersman. He's recognized he recognized in his explorations and going around out west during the 1800s that water was very limited and scarce, and it was going to make it difficult for us to plan and like decide like how was the West going to be expanded, you know, as part of the United States expansion during that period. And he said, you know, we've developed and planned our states this way for years, but because water is going to be so limited, we got to think of it completely different than we have in the past. So currently, we actually have what's like the Jeffersonian coordinate system. That's kind of like that grid system, and why all those Western states are pretty square in shape. So that has kind of dictated how we've done that expansion. But John Wesley Powell actually was, you know, his foresight actually saw the Dust Bowl and said, we have to make some changes, because if we're not doing this properly, we're going to have something that was devastating agriculture. And he was like, and the Dust Bowl was one of those things he kind of anticipated to happen. But when he went to the Senate to say, we need to rethink how we plan and expand the West, he went to Congress with this map. And this map is how he argued that we needed to plan the entire western half of the United States, that we plan the western half of the United States based off of watershed versus that Jeffersonian coordinate system that we currently use now. But just imagine how different the United States would look if this was what the western half of the United States looked like as compared to what we have now. But what we're looking at, you know, it makes sense. An old job of mine, I worked out in New Mexico, and part of it, some of the most difficult parts of the job was dealing with Western water rights, or those laws of prior appropriation. So this little pink area, can you see my mouse down here? So this is where I lived when I lived in New Mexico. And this is the Colorado boundary, kind of like right here. I guess I was like right here. This is Colorado boundary. So all of this water that was coming from the San Juan Mountains essentially came down through our portion of New Mexico and then went out into the Navajo reservation. That's called the San Juan River. But, you know, imagine if the entire western part of the United States was designated based off these watersheds. It would make us have a better understanding of water use and better control over how the states were using their own water, versus if you're downstream having to manage the water that you're given based off of the use by the people upstream. So this is just kind of like a neat perspective to think about, that the western part of the United States was almost laid out based off of watershed and using water as its primary driving factor. Now, I can't imagine this ever actually happening anymore, but there have been people that have actually brought this up to Senate committees as petition for hearing to restructure the United States based off a watershed. That would be, I think, a logistic nightmare nonetheless at this point.
Hey, Taylor,
Yes.
Diane is asking if the depiction of watersheds on that map is correct as we now know it, or if it's changed a lot since Powell's time.
I bet it has changed significantly since Powell's time, with the better surveying and understanding of routes, because we have a way more accurate depiction of how those rivers and tributaries interact now. But this would be relatively close to what is existing now, but with those more accurate surveying techniques and mapping techniques, yes, it would be slightly different just because we have a better understanding or better control and precision. So that's a very good question. Yeah. So this is the actual map that he presented, or a copy of it. It's not the real one. But anyway, so it's just a neat perspective to think about, that watersheds have always had a significant role, at least when we're talking about how we're planning, at least in the United States. So well over 100 years. But this is cool. You know, you'd say, okay, this is cool, Taylor, but why is this important? And it's important because I kind of mentioned it before, is we're all connected to the water. You know, no matter where you live with a watershed. You're impacted by something that's happening upstream, or you're impacting someone downstream. So if you're at the headwaters, a decision that you make can impact everyone downstream. Or even if you're in a recharge zone, whatever enters that aquifer, we're pulling right back up. And this is important because when we're thinking about let me get rid of that now. Okay, so when we're thinking about how Florida is developing, you know, we look at this map. Some of you have probably seen this map before, but this is from 2005, and this is looking at developed land. That's the red, versus conservation land or permanently protected land. So that could be conservation land, that's agriculture, that's permanently protected. And then all that beigey natural color, that's just undesignated. So it's not conservation land and it hasn't been developed. When I'm talking about developed, that doesn't count agriculture. That's like commercial, residential, urbanizing areas. So this is looking at that development in 2005. And we do know that based off of existing development patterns, as well as our growing population trends, that by the time we hit 2060 from when this study was done, there's updated maps. This all comes from what is called the Florida 2060 plan, but now there's a Florida 2070 plan. But what this is showing us is that we know what we can anticipate what Florida will look like once our population is expected to double in 2060. And using those existing development trends, this is what the state of Florida is. Whoop. Oh man, the map's away. It's a tiny map. Okay, so this is what the state's supposed to look like or anticipated to look like with those current development trends. So you can definitely see that's just significantly more red. I'm gonna do this real quick to allow you to see that a little bit better, because I think I know what happened. Boop. All right, we're back on track. There we go. All right, so yeah, so you can definitely see the change between the two. That was 2005, and this is the year 2060. And the difference between the 2060 and 2070 plan is very minimal. I know they're going to be looking at how that change occurs, especially with the new toll roads that are supposed to expand up to like the Nature Coast area. So this is just looking at that data, and most of that development is going to be happening in that central Florida, you know, that Tampa, Lakeland, the I-4 corridor is where we're going to see a lot of that development, and south of Orlando, Kissimmee. That's where most of the development is going to happen, besides just the coastal areas. But you can see how much of that landscape is going to change. And one of the most important things about that is if we're thinking that the population is going to double, that means we're going to have an increased demand for water. That means we're going to have increased pollution, and we're going to have a decreased habitats that help filter polluted runoff before it enters the aquifer or before it goes into our sinks. So that means that, you know, with more impervious sidewalks or roadways or anything like that, where you're losing that natural environment, something that you do down upstream is going to have not necessarily a bigger impact downstream, but it's not going to have that mitigation that the environment can give us naturally already. So there's not going to be natural ways that can help clean water, because the stuff that enters the stormway is going to always enter our streams, creeks, or come out into our aquifer. So with that being said, I want to kind of show like why that's important, because when we start talking about water demand and water pollution, I have a little video I want to share. So let me start that. So yeah, to add a visual, it shows, talking about pollution, it shows some rubber ducks coming down someone's driveway, and it's supposed to like visualize pollution. And what it does is, you know, you contribute a little bit, your neighbors contribute a little bit, and you start seeing this little line of rubber ducks kind of moving down the storm drain, and then, or down the gutter of the road, and then they all start entering the storm drain. And next thing you know it, all the roadways and gutters and stormways are filling up with all these rubber ducks all across the entire community. And then it ends like what's wasted here, so like what's wasted in our landscapes or yards, or how our yards are potentially improperly managed, can end up here, and it shows a little rubber duck boop, popping up in the lake. So that's the visual I was trying to show you before everything got closed down. So while we give everyone a couple minutes, there was a question that popped up: is there a way to divert water before it enters the ocean and try to get into the aquifer? Yes, but it's also much easier said than done, because you need water to go to the ocean, because you need it to help create that brackish water. So it's very fine balance between fresh and salt water. But that excess of water that's being created based off of stormwater runoff that's associated with land use change, you can think creatively in how you can use that water in different ways in your landscape or other like other cool, interesting ways. And we'll talk a little bit about it. To allow that water to filter into the aquifer rather than being lost to the ocean. So like one of the issues that we do see with more development is that impervious surfaces. So that landscape that was, say, non-developed or natural or is ag land, water could try to infiltrate through the soil. But now with impervious surfaces, there's a much higher chance of that water in a stormway that works its way out towards an ocean or some other water body. And that actually increases because there's a substantial increase in the amount of water that is now flowing as compared to what's natural, that it causes the riverways to kind of erode. It causes what we call is channelization, where the water ends up moving through so quickly because there's so much water that it destroys the riverbanks. It can deepen rivers and actually then cut off, the rivers can get cut off from their floodplains, which we use as a natural way to help manage pollutants in water because it can help clean the water. So it's just a domino effect. So thinking about how we can use that water before it enters our waterways, especially that water that's created through that land use change. And we'll talk a little bit about that. That's a key because it's something that you can do as a homeowner, but that's something that you can see communities doing, water management districts doing, to try to manage that excess of flow. So again, I want to apologize to everybody. The video, I'm not going to try doing that again because it all crashed on me. But I'll send that link out to everybody once I follow up with a copy, again, the copy of the presentation, but some additional resources that we have. So one of the issues that we wanted to talk about is with that increasing population and increasing development, we know that there's going to be bigger impacts on our environment, and every single decision that we make impacts something downstream, or we're being impacted by somebody upstream. So we're equally as responsible to our decisions that we make to make sure that we're helping conserve and preserve Florida's natural resources as much as possible. And one thing that's really important when we think about that is, you know, the landscaping impacts. So approximately, if we look at all water usage throughout the state, approximately 60% of homeowner water use in Florida is for lawn and landscape irrigation. That's a lot of water. And through that, you know, we're having excess of water entering our stormways, and it's going to carry pollutants. It can carry nitrogen, it can carry phosphorus, which is the fertilizers, the nutrients that we put down with fertilizers that lead to algal blooms like you see on the image to the right. So those algal blooms are fed by nutrient enrichment or nutrient sources, and a lot of that comes from residential land use. So it can also come from agriculture. It can come from essentially anybody that's using any type of fertilizer that's using it ineffectively. Some of the other common pollutants that we see associated with water quality, especially in Florida, is fecal coliform, and that essentially is poop, and that's associated with septic tanks, livestock, animal waste. So, you know, if you don't pick up after your dog, if they go poop, then that is a contributor to non-point source pollutant, and it's a fecal coliform, which has major impacts on our water bodies. But anyways, so that excess of water that ends up going into our landscape, because 60% is a lot, and we know that that's not required to maintain a healthy, strong landscape. So if we can follow best management practices, we can reduce our water use within the landscape, and we can reduce the amount of contributions that we unintentionally make, or completely eliminate any contributions to non-point source pollutants to Florida's water bodies. So I want to kind of show you a cool map. Hopefully the computer doesn't crash on me on this one, but this is through US EPA. It's called My Waterway Map. So I'm going to stop this share, and I'm going to jump. It's not a video, so theoretically it should work fine. All right, can you all see this map? Wonderful. So this is, no matter where you live in the United States, you can find your watershed that you live in on this. So this doesn't give us all the detail that we like, but this is a really cool resource. And at the end of the program, I'm going to have you actually go on this website and find like the watershed that you live in and see if there's any impairments. But a great example is like what's highlighted right now. This is Payne's Prairie. So Payne's Prairie has multiple little sub watersheds that kind of like feed into it. And what you can do on this website is you can click and explore the different watersheds in your area. Again, this doesn't give you the detail that I like, but this is Sweetwater Branch. And I'm going to take you kind of like a quick virtual tour here in a bit of Sweetwater Branch. But it is actually compared and considered an impaired waterway. And those impairments are associated with aquatic life and recreation, and that's linked to bacteria, other microbes, degraded aquatic life, and low oxygen. So, that's a major, not a major river, but it's a creek that a lot of people know about here in Alachua County. And then right over here, this is Hogtown Creek. Same thing, it's impaired for aquatic life and for recreation purposes. It has bacteria and other microbes as well as low oxygen. So that bacteria and other microbes, that's the fecal coliform pretty much. So it's coming from waste of septic or animal or anything like that that's having high E. coli or other fecal microbes in the water. So you can come on this website and you can explore all of these different watersheds all throughout the state or the United States. If you want to kind of peruse, if you like looking at maps and pulling up some things, you can click and kind of explore on here and look at some of the other impairments that the US EPA have designated as impaired. So this is a cool resource, and you can come up here and you can just type in your address and it'll take you to the watershed that you live in so you can kind of explore around it. So I'll stop this share. So when you start to ask people like, well, where do you live? You can now start to say to them, I was like, oh, I live in this watershed. I live in Hogtown Creek. I live in Sweetwater Branch. I live in the Gum Slough that feeds into Noonan's Lake. So it gives you an opportunity to tell a story, your story and how you are connected to the environment. A question just came in is like, what is considered an impaired waterway? So an impaired waterway essentially is constantly taking measurements and doing studies and studying water quality. And if there's a bunch of different benchmarks and different categories. And if we start taking specific measurements, so let's say like E. coli, and if it starts exceeding a certain threshold, it's essentially considered an impaired waterway, which means that the levels that are within that water are higher than was designated as safe. So if you're considered an impaired waterway, that means that you've exceeded some of those thresholds that the EPA has created or designated. Now, this is all actually set up as part of the Clean Water Act. And there's more details and information that we can go on to it, because like once you create an impaired waterway, you can create what is also called TMDLs. So it's the total maximum daily loads, which is the real thresholds that you cannot exceed, and management plans to help mitigate those. But an impaired waterway just means that some of those benchmarks that measure water quality, you're exceeding those health thresholds.
Hey, Taylor, Bradley was asking what HUC or granularity that map was.
Okay, so yes, right. Is that Bradley? Yes.
Facts.
I found that today, Bradley. That is the HUC level that I want. So that is a HUC 14 or 16. And I've been having a hard time finding that data. So that's a GIS question. But the HUC 12 and 14 relates to the amount of digits or numbers that you use. It's like a level of hierarchy, and it's the address, essentially, of watersheds. So every watershed has a designated HUC, or hydraulic unit code, HUC. And that just allows, if you're looking at watersheds, it allows you to look out from a very broad scale, like the entire Mississippi watershed, or you can have a very precise address where you zoom in very, very closely and you look at something as detailed as a tiny little tributary that might be 10 feet long, you know? So it's just a way for us to designate and classify and kind of identify where watersheds are.
Taylor, one more question. Diane is asking about the impact of septic tanks on impaired waterways and what can be done to mitigate that.
So that's a really, really hard question to answer. So there is some research on new septic tanks, I guess, at Post Springs, right? Post Springs, yes. Alachua County is doing some research on one that's supposed to help reduce nutrient loading as well as fecal coliform before it empties out into like the drain field. But the biggest thing is making sure that your septic tank is not damaged or cracked, making sure that it's managed appropriately. And in some cases, you have to completely replace them. Some of the biggest problems that we see with septic systems are failed septic tanks. So the tank in itself, or the container, is broken. So you're just having the sewage just go right out into the water. So monitoring and managing septic systems is going to be very, very important if you're on one. Outside of that, it's just really trying to convince municipalities to extend their wastewater out to your home, which is unbelievably expensive. Very, 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 very expensive. So that's a very good question. Very, very good question. All right. So let's get back in the presentation. So we'll come back to this, but when you start to say, you know, go ask your friends, where do you live? And see what they say, you know, and talk to them about watersheds and our role in the watershed. Everything flows downhill and we're somewhere in there, and we're directly connected to all parts of the environment and the landscape, whether we want to admit it or not. So this is where the Florida Landscaping Program comes in, because we talked about the importance of watersheds, and I'll go over these 9 principles, and I'm going to give you in follow-up email all the publications that go into really great detail about the Florida Landscaping Program. But this, when we start to think about what can we do as a homeowner, what can we do as a community member, if you're helping make some of those decisions, the Florida Landscaping Program is a great tool to help kind of determine what those best management practices are. It's not a aesthetic guideline, even though we do provide like landscape design typologies for, say, like an HOA, but it's not an aesthetic guideline, it's a maintenance guideline. And its whole goal is just an approach to help maintain fun, fancy, good yards that we like, that are friendly to wildlife, environmentally responsible, and they can also be less work than a traditional landscape, kinda, because you can still put a lot of energy into it if you are an active gardener and like to do certain things. But the ultimately comes back to Florida's water resources. How are we managing our landscapes to help conserve water? How are we managing our landscapes to help protect water quality? So, you know, talking about we're connected in the watershed, even though what we do in our landscape might be small, it helps contribute. It adds up. The minute you go and you talk to your neighbor, have them make one small change, it adds up. If you work with if you live in an HOA, a condominium association, or in a community where you have the ability to work with those leaders, or you are that leader that can help make these management decisions, that small behavior can have a much bigger change or impact to help lead to protecting Florida's water resources. So the Florida Landscaping Program, we break it down into 9 management principles. And the 9 management principles are right plant, right place, water efficiently, fertilize appropriately, mulch, attract wildlife, manage yard pest, recycle, reduce stormwater runoff. And this kind of goes back to the question a while ago about cisterns and diverting water. That's the excess of water. And then the last one is protecting the waterfront. And the protecting the waterfront, I think we need to redefine, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we get there. So all of these principles come back to water quality and water quantity. And it really starts with that right plant, right place. So right plant, right place is if we don't want to plant invasive species, no invasive species, no matter how beautiful that they can look. Coral ardesia is like public enemy #1, and it was brought here because it looked beautiful. And I do admit coral ardesia is beautiful, but it is highly, highly, highly invasive. So right plant, right place is really thinking about what plants grow well in the environmental conditions that you're planting. So if you're planting your landscape, you're looking at things like sun conditions, climate conditions. So earlier we're talking about like you live in climate zone 8B, 9A, some people are living down in 11, South Florida. So those climate conditions can dictate which plants do well. I know a lot of people right now that they have some tropical plants in Alachua County. They're regretting having those because we've had a lot of cold nights this year. Last night, I think we even had a freeze as well. So it's really thinking about what are the plants that thrive in those environmental conditions that you're planting. And we have the ability that if we put those plants in that location that thrive in the location that we're planting, then those plants are going to establish well. They're going to have a natural resilience against pests. They're going to require very little water to maintain, and they're just going to naturally thrive, which helps reduce your maintenance, but it's also ultimately going to come back to helping protect water quality and quantity. So right plant, right place. If you follow right plant, right place, all the other principles just kind of like fall in line, because you can get a landscape, you can get it established, and it's a healthy, thriving landscape, and you get to spend more time enjoying it than trying to keep it alive. The second principle is water efficiently. So watering efficiently is really, if you're irrigating your landscape, think of irrigation as a tool. Don't just set the timer and say, we're good. It's important to think about when do your plants actually need water? So if we're thinking that 60% of residential water is being used for irrigation, we know from the IFAS perspective that something is wrong, because plants that are the right plant in the right place really require very minimal or low water input. Because if they're established, they're planted in those environmental conditions that they thrive well in, then you're not going to need to do much. So that image on the right in this picture, dollarweed, the bane of turf grass owners in certain conditions. But if I see dollarweed, that means you're irrigating too much, because dollarweed likes a lot of moisture, and it likes way more moisture than turf grass does. So the simplest solution to help maintain turf grass, if you have dollarweed, is calibrate your irrigation system, and more than likely you're irrigating way too much. Our actual recommendation from UF IFAS Extension is, I do know that we have like the rainy season times where you can run your irrigation, and is like the different times of year. We have the winter growing season and the summer growing season. So here in Alachua County in the winter, you just run it once as per St. Johns River Water Management District. And in the summer, you can run irrigation twice a week. But our IFAS recommendations are just turn that puppy off. Turn off your irrigation system. Do not irrigate at all unless your plants are telling you, hey, I'm thirsty. Because we actually find that the plants that are riding that edge of drought conditions have deeper, better, healthier roots. And they actually are way more resilient in the landscape and look better. Because if you start to stress plants, you're going to bring in disease, you're going to bring in pest. If you have a stressed plant, you might as well just have like a big neon sign over it that's like an all-you-can-eat buffet sign. So watering efficiently is very, very important. And there's so many ways that we can irrigate as efficiently as possible. So micro irrigation within ornamental beds or low flow systems in irrigation beds. In turf grass, we now have like micro spray, micro trajectory rotors, which use substantially less water compared to a traditional rotor. So there's ways that we can make sure that we have an irrigation system set up that when we use it, and if we have to use it, it requires very little to no water. The third principle is fertilize appropriately. So I mentioned earlier that that nitrogen and phosphorus are one of the biggest contributors to our algal bloom outbreaks throughout the state. And whoop, it must be a timed slide. So fertilizing appropriately is only apply fertilizers if it's needed. So we always recommend do a soil test, because one thing is, one of our biggest contributors to pollution is phosphorus. But phosphorus is naturally occurring in our soils. So it's actually very rare that you should apply any phosphorus. And if you do, then more than likely it's just going to be completely wasted and be 100% contributed, or 100% of that will go towards water pollution in some capacity, or it can help contribute to water pollution, because they're not going to use any of it. So that's important to know, is do that soil test. See if phosphorus is even needed to be added, as well as that soil test will tell us our pH. So if your pH is off, your plants won't be able to uptake nutrients. No matter how much you fertilize, they won't be able to absorb those nutrients because the pH is off. And a simple pH imbalance can be fixed very easily, and you can immediately increase the efficiency of your plants to uptake any nutrients around it. So always fertilize appropriately by following our recommendations, IFAS recommendations, and it really varies based off of what you're growing. But by following those recommendations and getting your soil tests, you can significantly reduce the amount of fertilizer that you need. And a lot of times excess of fertilizer is being added way beyond what we recommend through IFAS. And in our field trials, we know that 99.9% of the nutrients applied are uptaken by some of the plants when they are applied appropriately. So fertilize appropriately, following those best management practices, and a soil test is the key to correctly starting that nutrient management. Fourth one is mulch. So mulch, what it can do is it can help reduce weed pressure. So it kind of keeps the weeds at bay within the landscape bed. It can, as it slowly breaks down, it can help add organic matter to the soil. So it can help build the soil. As well as it regulates soil temperature, and it can help plants use water more efficiently. So our hot Florida sun, so we have great water come in during a rain, but then the sun comes back out, it's going to start evaporating right out of the soil. So the mulch can help hold that moisture in the soil a little bit longer, so the plants can uptake it and it's not lost to evapotranspiration. But it's important that we think about what kind of mulches that we use. So any natural leaf litter mulch, it's stuff that you're collecting around the yard, is going to be sufficient. And pine byproducts like pine straw, pine bark. Other byproducts could be like eucalyptus and melaleuca. So those invasive species that we're trying to manage in South Florida can actually be a really good mulch. But just don't use cypress or cedar. Be very careful on the source that you're getting your mulches from, because you want to make sure that it's sustainably harvested. And our pine bark and pine straw, those pine byproducts, are going to be the best for your ornamental beds, because they're readily available, and we manage our pine stands in an effective manner where we're not causing deforestation for mulch. The fifth principle is attract wildlife. So an important thing is, as we're developing, if I was going to go back to that map of red, that is of what that development is going to look like in 2060. We see a lot more of what we call wildlife or habitat fragmentation. So essentially, we're starting to break apart all those natural areas into tiny little chunks, and they're all spread out. But that's really bad for natural wildlife, especially for that wildlife that is moving from location to location to location, or those migratory species, because we're stretching out those locations in which they can find food, water, protection, places for reproduction. And that will have a significant impact on wildlife, as well as the quality of wildlife. So I can talk all about, in another conversation, talking about the genetic makeup of wildlife, and it's important to connect those different habitats. So with that fragmenting habitat due to development, we can think about how our landscapes can be kind of just like little oasis for migratory species as they move through. So thinking about butterflies and birds providing water, shelter, food, all the necessities of life so that they can come into your landscape and they can find a little place of respite amongst an entire developed area. So attracting wildlife will not only beautify your yard, but it also creates a very necessary tool to make sure that we're having a strong wildlife and biodiversity in a fragmented landscape. Principle number 6 is managing landscape pests responsibly. So in this principle, it's really, you're going to have pests come into your landscape, but how are you going to manage them? So if you follow right plant, right place, yeah, you might have some bad bugs come in, but they're not going to cause much damage to your plants because you're always going to have pests in your landscape, but not all of them are going to be bad. But it's important that we always set realistic expectations. So yeah, a bug's going to come in, it can be a bad bug, but is it going to cause a lot of damage? And if it is a pest that you need to manage, there are appropriate ways that we can manage it. And that falls underneath that integrated pest management program, or IPM for short. So IPM, you start with cultural controls. That's like right plant, right place. Are you irrigating properly? Are you fertilizing appropriately? Just making sure you're taking care of the plants following their needs. And if you do that, that can naturally just ward off most pests. Next would be like the mechanical controls. So mechanical controls is like you walk and you see aphids on your plants and you just smash them, or you pick up a bug and you drop it in soapy water to kind of kill it. So those are just those manual control mechanisms. I always joke that a shoe is a really great tool for mechanical pest removal because you just smoosh them. But so you have cultural, mechanical, the next is biological control. And those are like our friendly predators, those insects in the landscape that really help us out, like a ladybug that you see munching on an aphid, or an air potato beetle that is destroying air potato vine throughout the landscape, which we love, or you might get something like a lacewing. So these are the insects that we're just using natural predators to help control some of the pests within our landscapes. And there's some other biological control methods. And then the last but not least, if nothing else helps manage pests in the landscape, that's when we think about some of those other chemicals that you could apply. But if you're following IPM and you have those realistic expectations, it's going to be very rare that you get to that point. Principle number 7 is recycle yard waste. So yard waste is, how do we compost? How are we taking the stuff that yard waste that occurs within our landscape? How are we letting it break down and recycling back into our landscape so those nutrients that are in that decomposing litter get picked back up by the plants? So it helps retain the nutrients in your landscape. And some of the big issues that we see is like grass clippings, leaves, all that stuff that ends up in the storm drain or the gutter that you see on the left gets right into our creeks and streams, and it leads to algal blooms, or contributes to algal blooms, because as that natural litter breaks down, it releases nitrogen and phosphorus into the water. So even like if you have natural leaf litter that's coming from pine trees, oak trees, or any tree in your landscape, and you're seeing that all gathering around a storm drain or in the gutter, that's going to end up in the storm drain and lead to or help contribute to those algal blooms. So clean up the storm drains and the gutters and make sure no leaf litter is getting down there. Principle number 8, this is reducing stormwater runoff. So the biggest thing is we have rain come in. Can we capture, store, and convey that water and then reuse it, let it naturally infiltrate back into the soil? So some easy ways that we can do as a homeowner is like rain barrels can be effective. Large cisterns are wonderful too, because you can catch enough water in a cistern from your roof that will be all the water you need for your landscape ever, because it'll constantly refill itself with rain from storm events. And you can irrigate with that. I wouldn't irrigate vegetable gardens with anything that comes off of your roof, just in case of any of the chemicals or anything that's associated with the roofing comes with it. But that cistern is you're collecting water and you're reusing it at another time on your property, so then it can infiltrate down into the soil rather than leaving the property and ending up in our storms and creeks. Our retention ponds can help, but to a certain extent. So reducing stormwater, really thinking about, can we use that stormwater creatively within our landscapes before they end up going into the roadway or the storm drains or entering the creeks within our communities. The last one is protect the waterfront. So this comes back to that question, where do you live? So our IFAS recommendations, when we're talking about the waterfront, we're really talking about like leave a 10-foot no maintenance or maintenance-free zone around all water bodies, because that means that any misapplied nutrients or misapplied fertilizers or pollutants, you have a natural landscaped buffer that's not being maintained that can help infiltrate and intercept a lot of those pollutants before they enter the water body. But you know, this is that principle I was talking about. Maybe we need to think about how do we redefine it, because when we think about protecting the waterfront, that isn't limited to those that literally live on the waterfront. You know, we are all connected via the watersheds to all water. So this is just a general responsibility, I think, of every Floridian, that we think about our role within our watersheds and our impacts on water. So in review, these are the 9 principles that we just kind of quickly ran over, and I'll send you a lot of details in that publication, like I mentioned, going over these in more detail. But right plant, right place. We follow right plant, right place. Everything else falls in line with regards to the FFL program and protecting water quality and water quantity. So these are these resources, again, that when we talk about like, where do you live? We have that EPA, that My Waterway Map. Another cool little resource that we have is, I'm going to get that going. It's actually from Gainesville Creek website. Let me see where I can find it. I have to hide this. This is it right here. So this is with Gainesville Clean Watershed, Gainesville Clean Water Partnership. And I will give you'll have this link as well, but you know, they have a lot of information about different watersheds, creeks and waterways here in Alachua County, and somewhere is the map. Where did the map go? I'll just type that in and I'll, boop, here we go. We'll go to this way. So this is the Gainesville map through that Gainesville Clean Water Partnership. And up here, I always click watersheds, and you can kind of click and explore, find where you live, and you can find all this little extra information about watersheds specifically in Gainesville. And it gives you a little bit more detail than that other map that we looked at. So it allows you can like click on, say you live on the Royal Park, the Royal Park Creek. You can click there, and then they have like a little extra information about what's happening within that watershed. So this is a neat little website that you can go on and you can learn where you live within Gainesville with a little bit more precision than the other website. So I know we're running out of time, and I want to make sure that we have enough time for questions. So what I'll do is I'll kind of skip forward through our virtual tour. And then at the end, maybe I'll give you some time to explore where your watershed is. But you can always do that right after this program. You can go to one of these 2 websites, and and kind of explore and learn where you live exactly, with like a little bit more precision, but just resources that you can have and you can share with others. So let's do this like little virtual tour of Sweetwater Branch. So the reason I chose Sweetwater Branch is because I already had the map made from a previous program. But it's an easy one to explore if you're here in Alachua County, especially if you're in the city of Gainesville, because if you wanted to, you could go to multiple stops along this watershed and explore it with yourself or your family, and you can kind of just transect, or you can start at one in the watershed and you can work your way all the way across it, and you can see how the landscape interacts with this creek. So, Sweetwater Branch, and we're going to kind of jump through different parts of this. Sweetwater Branch watershed, its impairments are bacteria and other microbes of fecal coliform. There's degraded aquatic life, and there's very low oxygen. So low oxygen, obviously, in the water is going to lead to limited aquatic activity because there's not any oxygen, or not enough oxygen to live. So we're going to kind of like poke through this watershed at different locations, and in the future I've done it before with some master gardeners and like 4-H, but we actually do a walking tour of this watershed. So we'll do this again in the future for the public, but on this virtual tour we'll visit some very common areas that you've probably heard of. So there's Sweetwater wetlands. We'll start there. We'll go to Depot Park. We'll kind of peruse through Duck Pond neighborhood, and then we'll enter the headwaters area of Sweetwater Branch. So I need to stop share. I'm using multiple shares today of different websites. So, but this one, we're just actually going to use Google Maps. So Sweetwater Wetlands Park, many of you know this, know of this location, but it's on the southeast side of Gainesville, right off of 331. And I mean, if you haven't been there, go. It's absolutely beautiful. So Sweetwater Branch Wetlands Park was built essentially to take all that water that's coming from upstream, try to collect it and clean it before it ends up down here. Where's the sink at? Alachua Sink. So Sweetwater Branch was channelized essentially years ago and would come right over here to Alachua Sink. So all the crud and trash and everything that was coming down Sweetwater Branch ended up in our aquifer. The stories of like, they found vehicles, they found refrigerators, sofas, and that's just the visible garbage and trash. So this was kind of built to kind of like, let's clean the water and before it enters Payne's Prairie and before it ends up in the aquifer, and they've created a beautiful park out of it. So you can come out here and you can kind of peruse around the wetlands. But what I find is the most starking location is up here on the northern side of the property. This is where all the water comes in. And at this little dike area, there's a big trash collector, these giant grates that capture large trash or items of trash before it enters the wetlands. And then this area right here is a sediment basin. So all the sediments and soils and stuff that's being pulled down from upstream, it settles out right here before it comes into the wetlands. And these wetlands help remove the fecal coliform, the nutrients, and all of that, the bad pollutants from the water before it ends up out in Payne's Prairie. So you can actually go down here, and you can't go within the gate that's here, but you can see that garbage and trash, and you can see the sediment basin. And when they go in and remove that, they've told me it's just like dozens and dozens of dump trucks just filled with sediment that they have to pull out of there when they clean it because of everything that's being pulled down from upstream. So we'll continue on moving upstream. This area just north of it is Sweetwater Preserve, which they have some trails and stuff like that. But then it kind of, you have this wetland area, this natural area, but then we start to see how it kind of meanders. It meanders through here. We have some industrial area, some residential area, and it actually ties in with Depot Park. So Depot Park is a brownfield site of an old industrial area. And now what they do is Sweetwater actually runs underground right here. You can't see it, but it's right underneath the ground right here. You can see where it picks back up, Sweetwater Branch Creek. And some of that water is actually treated within Depot Park before it enters back out into Sweetwater. So Depot Park, too, is a really neat park that you can go to and explore, but they've turned this water treatment into a really cool amenity to help manage some of the pollutants and sediments that occur within the water before it enters our natural areas. So keep going north. This is like the GRU facility. And again, here's downtown area. Contents, where's the Hippodrome is this red roofed building right here. And then this is the library here, I believe. Yes, that's the library, Bo Diddley Plaza for context. But Sweetwater Branch runs up through here, and then we come into the Duck Pond neighborhood. So the Duck Pond neighborhood is a beautiful neighborhood. It's our historic downtown community. And Sweetwater Branch just kind of runs between the roadways up here. And you can see like this Sweetwater Branch, this is it right here. This is the actual duck pond, but I think it's known for its swans currently. But what's happening here is you're seeing these homes pretty much right up against this creek. It's a beautiful part of town. But some of the things that's important to note, and it's not just this location that I'm going to show you here on Google Maps, but it's all up and down the stream. But you see this storm drain right here. This storm drain exits like 5 feet away right into the water. So all the oil, any grass clippings, any pollutant that's in the roadway literally is just getting moved right into this Sweetwater Branch, and it just moves its way downstream. And that happens, not just in Duck Pond, but all throughout this entire urban area. As the storm drains drain into here, and they pick up everything along the way. So whether it's industrial, it's residential, and that's where we have a lot of our control over. Or if it's like you're walking your dog, pick up after your dog's waste. Because this is fecal coliform, it's one of its impairments. But you can see that the direct connection that we have between our land use and those developed and urbanizing areas and water bodies. So Sweetwater Branch runs up all the way through the Duck Pond area, and it ends up, this is 8th Avenue? No, which road is this? It's not giving my roads. 10th Avenue right here. But it goes underneath the ground right here, and we no longer see it. We're now at the upper end of the watershed. And when I do this walking tour, I'm not gonna ruin it for anybody completely, but I always end our tour in this parking lot, because every storm drain in this parking lot is a headwater source. It just gets drained and comes out this pipe. So it's important to know that within our urban areas or urbanizing areas, where we have areas with these impermeable surfaces like parking lots, buildings, sidewalks, that water works its way into our water bodies and impacts everything downstream. And we are directly linked into that. And in that watershed, as you know, from the 1,000-foot view, get everything on here as much as possible. So at the bottom, we have Sweetwater Wetlands Park. It's a beautiful park. But when you start to go upstream, you start to see all the impairments, all the contributing factors that can lead to the pollutants that are happening downstream that required this in the first place. So every decision of every person living in that watershed has an impact. So it's a matter of, are you following this best management practice to reduce those impacts on our waterways, and what are you doing as a homeowner? And one of those things that you can really look at is following those Florida-friendly landscaping principles with the FFL program. So that was a quick tour. But so in conclusion, we talked about watersheds. We really talked about our role within the watershed. We talked about, you should be able to now answer, what is the Florida-friendly landscaping program? But, we're starting to see with that tour and our relationship with watersheds, that connection that we have, that FFL program, and how it can affect the watersheds that we're connected to. Because the FFL program is a great way that we can adopt different best management practices that can be used to reduce and limit pollutants and protect water quality and quantity within the watershed that we live in. So, and I think that's it. I can open it up for questions. Here's my contact information. I'll go ahead and I'll pull up the Q&A box, but I'll try not to block that info, but you can put some of your questions or anything like that within the chat box or the Q&A box. So, oh no, the ducks got relocated. I just saw your note, Mark. Yes. Oh, so on that Sweetwater Wetlands tour, we started at the bottom of the watershed and we worked our way upstream. So when we're at that Sweetwater Wetlands Park, everything from the watershed, that's where it's coming down to. So in the chat box, our question is, how do you take a soil test? I'll follow up with that form. UF, we have a soil testing lab on campus. And on that form, it's very simple directions. It shows you how to take that soil test and where to submit it to. And you can submit that sample to them. And then you will get a digital copy of it, as well as I will. So, well, it goes to the county that you live in. So if you live in Alachua County, I get a copy of it. But if you live in like Marion or Lake County or Duval County, that county will get the copy of those results. But soil tests are actually really, really easy. You just dig up some soil samples from all around the area of the landscape you want to test, and you kind of mix it all together. So it's like an average. And then you take a sample from that, and that's what you submit to get your soil test. So I'm going to review, make sure I got everything. Yes, and of course, Sweetwater Wetlands Park was designed like a gator head. Very, very appropriate and fitting. But I encourage you, as we're sitting here, and I'm going to follow up with a survey because I want to challenge you before you do this, before you fill out the survey, and I'm going to send it to you all in email. What I recommend is go and find your watershed. Where do you live? Think about that differently. When someone says, "Where do you live?" You say, "Oh, I live in Sweetwater watershed." They'll look at you weird, but it shows that you're thinking about where do you live within your environment, and it shows that you have a better understanding of what your connection is to the environment around you. So one question is, how can you get involved with local watershed cleanups? So there's different groups will do them. Like I think Sierra Club has done some before. The Paynes Prairie Native Plant Society chapter has done some before in Alachua County. But I would recommend, just looking around some of those, reach out to the extension office to see what groups might be doing them. We haven't done them per se from our county extension office that I can think of, Mark. Of course, I've only been involved. I've only been in our office for 2.5 years, but have you ever done one in the past? It's a watershed cleanup.
Nope.
No.
I know they have some local river cleanups, but I don't know about watershed cleanup.
Yeah. So maybe we'll do that as a future program. As we tour Sweetwater Branch, we'll clean up at the same time. I like that. So one question that came in is, can I mention buffers? Yes. So a lot of buffers. So going back to buffers, so principle number 9 of the Florida Landscaping Program, protecting the waterfront, we recommend a 10-foot no maintenance buffer. And that buffer is typically going to be a natural vegetated space that separates a water body from where a managed area is. If you want a really good example of what a buffer looks like, look at agricultural lands, because a lot of ag lands are required by different state and federal laws to have specific buffers to water bodies. And you'll see streams or creeks or other water bodies on ag lands, and they're going to have a vegetated buffer all around those water bodies. And that is so that vegetated buffer can help reduce nutrient loading and pollutant runoff associated with the agriculture. Great example going into history, talking about the Mississippi Delta and where the Mississippi comes out in the Gulf of Mexico. So Mississippi in the Gulf right there has always been horrible for eutrophication, algal blooms associated with nitrogen and phosphorus. And it's like, what decisions can you make to manage all that water that is coming downstream from, a third of the United States surface area? So a buffer requirements was one of those tools that was put into place to help manage nutrient runoff. So buffer requirements were put in for like agriculture and other land uses, and it was actually a significant reduction in nutrient runoff. And it's not just agriculture, but just any managed lands having those buffers. So look around and you'll start to see those protected vegetated areas that are around water bodies. So sometimes they're voluntary, others they're actually required to be there. So dried septic sludge to put on acreage, is it good or bad? I would say it's bad because a lot of that is human waste sludge, and that carries all sorts of nasties. So if it was like cow, chicken, or anything like that, that'd totally be fine, livestock related. But I wouldn't recommend using human waste. So of course, there are some areas where it's designated to dump septic, and that's what's going to be best. So. Yeah. Okay. So someone in the chat box said that they have 80 acres in Michigan. Ooh, I bet you all are cold. And they have 10-foot water buffer by every waterway creek on the farm. Awesome. Awesome. Oh yeah, our Santa Fe River. Thank you. Thank you, Ann. So our Santa Fe River does cleanups, and that's a nonprofit organization that focuses primarily on the Santa Fe. And is that based at Rum Island? Is that correct? I can't remember where that's based out of, but our Santa Fe River. Yeah. So one question is, can communities monitor urban irrigation use and enforce limits? Very good question. So it depends on where you live. If homeowners within communities are on wells, no, because especially if it's an owner-owned well, individually owned well, they by state have the right to use that water as they please. They don't really have the same restrictions as other places. But like say you live in a homeowners association or a community association, yes, to a certain extent, you can monitor urban irrigation use and enforce limits. It is much harder said, it's much easier said than done because we have our county irrigation restrictions, and those are really difficult to enforce, very, very difficult to enforce. But a lot of it is communication and education because of the irrigation timers, the set it and forget it mentality that Ron Popeil, was that Ron Popeil that did the rotisserie chicken thing? But the set it, forget it, as seen on TV ad, doesn't work for irrigation. So a lot of times people set their timers and they completely forget about it, and it's irrigating at 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the morning, and they don't really know. So having really strong awareness and an education on what our irrigation systems are as a tool and not necessary, and to keep them off until we have drought conditions that our plants indicate that we need to run them. So it can be hard for communities to monitor urban irrigation use and enforce limits, but it is possible, but it can be very difficult to do. Yes. So I do know some communities that the entire irrigation system is ran off of a single well. And that single well, they control irrigation throughout the entire community from that single well. So the HOA in this instance monitors and runs the entire irrigation system. But one of the issues that they ran into is their well, I can't remember the full story, but the well pump broke during a very drought period, and they and they couldn't run their irrigation because the cost to fix it. So if I remember correctly, it caused a lot of plant dieback because there's a lot of plants that were required on the water and the irrigation during that drought season. So I guess it can be a catch-22 depending on how you do it. So there are some ways to kind of find like your water usage or your water usage history. There's an old public beta site called GainesvilleGreen.com, I believe. And on there, you can like type in your address and it'll show you your water usage. And I think that you have to be within GRU service area to look at that. So great question. Yeah, I think it's always been a beta page. I don't know if it's ever been updated. But I think I can't remember. I've met the guy's name that managed it. years ago, but nonetheless, it was kind of an interesting because you can compare yourself to your neighbors or kind of looking what's on there when the data is updated. So, but Gainesville Green beta. So one question that just popped up was, what about water treatment facilities? Very good question. How do they get the water, and where do they how do they clean the water, and where do they discharge? So it really depends on the wastewater site. So there are certain standards that you have to meet for clean water, just flat period. Some people will clean above and beyond those. But some of the outlets that you see, those discharge, so those are called, those discharge are actually monitored. And, you know, a lot of the pollution that we talked about is non-point source pollution. And non-point source pollution is the stuff that we can't trace where it's actually coming from. But other than it's just like a widespread distributed coming in from multiple sources. But the water treatment facilities, they are point source. So we can say this water coming out of this location is coming from this certain place. It's, you know, it falls underneath what we call the National Pollution Elimination Discharge something, NPDS. It's all through EPD. But anyways, so they have certain requirements that they must meet for cleaning water. And they, depending on where you're at, they can discharge in different ways. Coastal areas will just outlet right out into the ocean. Others will do an aquifer pump where they just have a pipe that just goes straight down right into the aquifer. Others will just pump it right out into a freshwater system and it just goes on its way. And there's some really advanced methods where sometimes you'll see that water is treated what we say is a tertiary treatment. And the tertiary, or like third treatment, is we can use natural process to help kind of clean and manage the water before it enters the waterways. So it's a very big question to answer, but some of those tertiary treatments is really like you can make like man-made wetlands, and that water comes discharged out, and so then you're having this natural processes that's cleaning the water before it enters the ecosystems even further. So it's almost like sweetwater wetlands, but you're just putting all your wastewater out through that location. So this is a great question. West Coast is having significant saltwater infiltration or saltwater intrusion. We have that here all throughout the state as well. And how can those urban areas be supplied with water while providing enough for environment? It comes down to proper usage of water, having higher efficient homes, like we have the Florida Water Star program. But one of the things is still saltwater intrusion is happening, and that's because we're overdrawing from the aquifer. So smart use with water. So right plant, right place, watering efficiently, reducing the amount of water needs that we have and that water that we use within our landscapes. So we make sure that we are having enough water and using it appropriately for us to just live, but also making sure that we have enough water for the environment. Because if we think about Florida's ecosystems, has evolved with a certain amount of water within the environment and ecosystem. So if we disrupt that at all, it throws off the entire system. So yes, and we are dealing with saltwater intrusion here. So Doctors Lake, I believe on the St. Johns River, is on the Clay County side of the St. Johns River. You can actually see how the saltwater levels have increased slowly over time within Doctors Inlet, and it used to be 100% fresh water, and it's pretty far inland as compared to some of our other places. So we're definitely seeing that. And that's all associated with over withdrawal and overuse along the coastal areas. In the future, can water consumption be regulated with staged pricing? Yes, GRU does that. Based off of the more you use, it has tiered pricing. The more you use, the more expensive it is. So we're seeing that, and we're seeing it in some areas. I don't know what people are spending, but there are some pretty extreme requirements for the more you use, the more you end up spending. So some other ways that we're looking at it is how we're doing developments. How do we change the landscapes, or when we're planning and designing communities, what are the ways that we're putting in water efficiency into those standards? So like Florida Water Star requirements for all homes is going to be significant change. to making sure that homes are using very minimal water. As well as, I would not be surprised that if new developments in the future, we're going to start seeing gray water reuse systems and cisterns being standard within a lot of homes that we develop, to make sure that those overall total water usage is significantly reduced. So, you want to say hi, buddy? I got my background. So that's all I have. If there's any other questions, thank you all for joining us this evening. This is my son. He just got home from school. Can you say hi? Hi. Yeah, there we go. And the little one's being held by mom right now. But I appreciate everybody coming today. And I'm obviously at home. The other one's right here. So he's a newborn. But anyways, feel free to reach out to me at any time if you have any questions about the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program, what you can do within your community, and let us be that resource and that solution for your life and your community. And thank you. Yeah, and we have some other resources. I'll include it in the email. We have a Florida Friendly Landscaping webpage specifically for Alachua County that we built, that includes a lot of our county specific resources, as well as we have our YouTube page where we post stuff, our Facebook page. We have a podcast where we do monthly programs. So there's a lot of ways you can plug resources. So Mark, I want to thank you very much. I want to thank you everybody for joining us.
You're welcome.
You say bye? You messing with it? Can you say bye? There we go. Y'all take care.
See ya.
See ya.